America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we're excited to be joined by John Palatiello. John is the president of the Business Coalition for Fair Competition, an organization comprised of trade associations, businesses, and organizations dedicated to free enterprise, relief from unfair government-sponsored competition, and maximum government reliance on the private sector. John, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us all about the Business Coalition for Fair Competition and maybe an overview of the privatization side of things as well.
Well, you hit the key word, Elaine, privatization. The Business Coalition for Fair Competition is all about allowing the free market to thrive and to rely on private enterprise for things that are commercially available. Unfortunately, we have too much of a phenomena in our country where a lot of what government does is not what we traditionally think of as far as governing. It's not the FBI. It's not environmental protection. It's actually government performance of services that are commercial in nature and otherwise available from the private sector through the competitive free enterprise system. So BCFC is all about advocacy of the private sector and trying to move government policy in favor of private sector utilization and streamlining government to its core inherently governmental functions that we have come to expect from government, and limiting government to those things that private enterprise cannot do.
John, can you give our listeners a bit of the scope of the problem, a scope of just how much government land and resources and services the government owns?
It's going to be shocking to you. Just looking at the federal government alone, and this is not solely a federal issue. The phenomena of government competing with or duplicating private enterprise is at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. But let's look at the federal government for a moment, because that's the easiest to get your arms around and to capture data. The federal government has about 2 million federal employees. That does not include our men and women in uniform military service, and that does not include the Postal Service, which is a whole different kettle of fish, if you will. But all of the alphabet of agencies that we're familiar with have about 2 million employees. In 1998, Congress passed a law called the FAIR Act, the Federal Activities Inventory Reform Act, and it requires agencies to annually submit data on their workforce and take that yellow legal pad and draw a line down the middle of it. And on one side is employees that are involved in activities that are commercial in nature, and the other side are those that are involved in things that are inherently governmental in nature. Well, the last set of data that we've received from the Office of Management and Budget reports that 1.1 million federal employees, over half of the federal workforce, are on that commercial activity side of the ledger. So that it's rather astonishing that wow. much of our government and that much of our government workforce is doing things that otherwise could be done by private enterprise, by small business, by minority-owned firms, by businesses of all sizes, shapes, and forms of ownership.
So what are some big examples? What is really driving that 1.1 million?
It's almost everything that you can think of. you've got government employees creating websites, doing information technology, surveying the land, designing new roads and bridges. BCFC is a strong believer in something called the Yellow Pages test, and that is if the government is doing something and you can find a business in the yellow pages of the phone book doing the same thing, then we ought to be at first questioning whether government needs to do that, and further putting in a process by which you can evaluate whether the private sector is actually the more higher quality and more cost-effective provider of those goods and services.
What are some of the solutions that you're focused on right now? I mean, how do we fix this?
Well, first of all, this is not a new issue. In 1955, the Eisenhower administration issued a policy that stated that the government should not be competing with its citizens, and the government should be using the private sector to the maximum extent possible. That in those days, we did not have an Office of Management and Budget. We had the Bureau of the Budget. Today, OMB has circulars which guide federal agencies. During the Eisenhower years, we had Bureau of the Budget bulletins. And so that policy that says the government should rely on the private sector to the maximum extent possible and should not compete with its citizens actually has a framework by which government agencies should be operating. When the Bureau of the Budget became the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, the bulletins became circulars. And there is a federal circular that, again, has its origins in 1955. It's now OMB Circular A76. And it spells out the process by which all of those commercial activity positions in the federal workforce should be reviewed and then move towards a direct public-private cost comparison and analysis. And it is an attempt to quantify all of the costs of government performance of an activity, and then go out to the private sector for proposals, compare the private sector proposal to the government cost, and the better offer should win. We would like to see that more forcefully implemented. Unfortunately, since about 2009, if my memory serves me correctly, Congress has put a moratorium on those reviews. So today, an agency cannot even look at a commercial activity within its workforce and look to outsource that to the private sector. So that would be the first and foremost solution to this problem. And the second is there is a piece of legislation that has been in Congress for a number of years. It's called the Freedom from Government Competition Act. Congressman Bean from Florida is the sponsor of the bill in the current Congress. And it would, by law, implement a process like the one that I just mentioned in OMB Circular A76. So there are a variety of tools that agencies could utilize to expand the use of the private sector, get the government more focused on things that only the government can do, and have a better balance between its workforce and the private sector workforce.
Is that primarily focused on the legislation? Is that focused at the federal level only, or would it affect state government positions as well?
It focuses on the federal government. Okay. There has been activity in a number of states. There are states like Colorado, for example, has a law on unfair government competition. Arizona has a law. Maine has a commission, a body that a business person could bring a complaint about a state government activity that competes with his or her firm and take it to that commission, and that would trigger a review. So Virginia used to have a commission like that. Unfortunately, it got rather tired and did not do a lot of work. And so when a governor came in and was doing some house cleaning. He eliminated a number of different boards and commissions that really weren't functioning well. And the Commonwealth Competition Council, unfortunately, is one that went by the wayside. So there, again, as I said before, this is an issue not only at the federal level, but the state and local level. And there are solutions at the federal as well as state and local levels. And in fact, if I can make one more point, the phrase Yellow Pages test was coined in Indianapolis, Indiana, which very aggressively implemented this process at the city level. And it has been emulated by governors and mayors across the country on a bipartisan basis. There have been Democratic governors that have been as strong an advocate for eliminating government competition, right-sizing their government, as there have been Republicans. So unfortunately, at the federal level, it has become a rather partisan issue. At the state and local level, it has been a very bipartisan issue.
Just one more quick question before I turn it over to you, Jordan. So it's a partisan issue, so that explains a lot to me right there. But what are the primary arguments against this? And the reason why I ask is because, we just had a report, a huge revision in jobs for about the last 12 months of about 818,000 jobs. And what that did when we started looking at where the jobs were disappearing, but also where the jobs are being created, even with that revision, half of them are being created in government or quasi-government. If you just look at the government, it's probably around that 35 or so percentage amount of jobs being created in the government. So I would argue that small business specifically, but large companies too, but small businesses are competing with our government just for labor.
That is a more recent manifestation of this entire issue, that we have such a limited U.S. workforce that in the past it was competition over who gets to do the work. Now it's competition over who gets the workers. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. We always say that small businesses can't compete against the government. I mean, I don't even think big businesses are in cahoots with the government. Small businesses can't compete with the government in this situation. John, just getting.
Well, let me interrupt you for a moment. Small business can.
Okay.
If they're provided the opportunity and there's a level playing field evaluation, small businesses can. Before this moratorium went into effect, the Small Business Administration did an analysis on this OMB A76 public-private competitions. Small businesses won 71% of the competitions. So this moratorium is a very anti-small business action that Congress has taken.
Okay. So even with unlimited resources the government has, small businesses are just so competitive and so entrepreneurial that they can outcompete?
That's the bottom line.
Well, that's a great message that all our listeners will love. John, how much of the problem is federal ownership of land? The federal government owns, I believe, most of the land in the West, or at least a huge portion of it. And keeping up with that must just be a massive undertaking of bureaucratic oversight and jobs. Is that something you look at, or is that not just a drop in the bucket?
It is a very big issue. It is a politically charged issue. I've been around the block long enough to remember the Sagebrush Rebellion when President Reagan was elected, when Westerners were very upset about federal land management policies. And you have counties in the West where better than 90% of the land mass of the county is owned by the federal government. Well, how do you have a tax base to pay for schools and police and fire if you can't have property taxes on 90% of the land mass of your area? There seems to be a different trend today, even in the West, about federal ownership of land. I was just reading an article this morning about the Senate race in Montana, and this idea of privatizing federal land has become an issue in that Senate race. So the land ownership of the government is an issue. In fact, the government does not have a current accurate inventory of the land it owns. It doesn't know about all the land that it owns. And doing any kinds of records research, for example, if you're a land surveyor and you're looking to do research to establish who owns what property, where the boundaries are, it's a very difficult task because there are some land records in Washington, D.C., and some are in like the state offices of the Bureau of Land Management. Some of them are digital and accessible over the web. Some of them are in paper files in file cabinets. And so Congress did pass a law 2 years ago, not to confuse you with the legislation I just mentioned that I call the FAIR Act. There is legislation that Congress just passed 2 years ago called the FLAIR Act, Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act. And it is an effort to use modern geographic information systems to map it once, use it many times, but have a current accurate inventory of all the land the federal government owns. The agencies have been very slow to begin implementing that law, but it's a way to at least start getting some idea of what the magnitude of the problem is. And quite frankly, it's an effort to be able to categorize the land the federal government owns, because there are studies that show that there are lands that are still in federal ownership with no identifiable reason why the government needs to own it. And so surplus and disposal of unneeded land is a extraordinarily difficult process for the federal government. It's much easier for the government to acquire land than it is to dispose of land.
As we hear some of the candidates that are running for president, the candidate on the left in particular, talks about some of the specific policies that they are getting behind in the housing market, mortgages, things like that, banking. We have heard calls from Congress to create a government bank. As we hear that, I mean, do you see an end do you see this problem just continuing to get bigger and bigger and creating a bigger government?
Well, the record is pretty clear that the government gets bigger and bigger every year. There's no question about that. It's interesting that you bring up, for example, housing as an example, Elaine. I think the most successful thing the federal government has done in almost 250 years was the GI Bill after World War II. My dad was a World War II D-Day veteran. And what the government did after World War II, and young people like my dad came back from the war and started families and got into careers, the GI Bill did two things. Number one is it said, go get an education. And number two is go buy a home. But how did the government do that? The federal government did not start creating a bunch of schools. It gave every eligible veteran a voucher to go into the existing education system and get a college degree, a technical degree, a certification for a given occupation or profession. The government also didn't start becoming a home builder. It gave you a voucher for a low interest loan to go and buy a home. And that created, at the time, the biggest expansion of our economy in history. And how was it done? With a voucher system, not by growing government and adding more government employees. It was a voucher to say, go into our great free enterprise system, do things that we know are going to build our economy, create wealth, and do it through a voucher in private enterprise. So I think that's a model that we ought to look at more often in this country. When we have an issue, today affordable housing is an issue for some. There is a way to use the free market to solve that challenge. You don't need big government to solve it.
How does the proposed policy of a potential Harris-Walz administration to give first-time home buyers $25,000 assistance towards down payment versus the ability to access those lower interest rates. How do you sort of separate those for, a young couple that hears that kind of policy, says, my gosh, this would be great to get 25,000, but how do you distinguish which one is better or how they're different for a young couple to help them understand really the bigger picture of how these policies work?
Well, I think it's difficult because with all due respect to Vice President Harris, she has not laid out a lot of detail to her plan. And I think on first blush, a young couple would look at that and say, oh, isn't that great? We get a $25,000 tax credit or a $25,000 stipend for a down payment on the house. But step back and think about it. What's the average cost of a home in the United States today? Well, the $25,000 is just a drop in the bucket, number one. Number two, any of us who have had a mortgage on our home, a 30-year mortgage, know that you really don't pay down a lot of the principal until the very end. You're mostly paying for interest. So to make housing more affordable in America today, there's one basic, easy solution. Bring down interest rates, because that will bring down the cost of mortgaging a home over 30 years, much more than by $25,000 over the life of that mortgage.
Yeah,
but the vice president, unfortunately, has not thought through this process, or I'll be generous and say they at least have not laid out the details of this process. And I don't mean to be cynical, but in campaigns, candidates often say things that are kind of like eye candy. Gee, it sounds good, but if you drill into the details, it may not be as an attractive proposal as one would think, but it gets a lot of interest and attention, and they hope support in the middle of an election campaign.
Yeah, my daughter and her fiance just bought a house, and the back and forth on should we or shouldn't we move now because interest rates are high. My advice to them was the cost of housing isn't going to come down, but eventually, hopefully, fingers crossed, what can come down and what hopefully will come down is the mortgage rates. And that's where they will be able to bring down the cost of their, monthly payment on their mortgage. So my advice for them was to go for it and hopefully refinance at a future date.
Right. Well, the other aspect of the vice president's proposal that, again, the devil is in the details, and we don't have the details, is there going to be a background credit check on the borrower? Is anybody and everybody eligible for that $25,000? Because it could end up being a situation where that $25,000 is provided to someone who's not creditworthy. And, we all saw in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis what happens when people get underwater on a home they can't afford. So there's still a lot more detail to this proposal that I think needs to be worked out.
John, how much could privatization help the fiscal situation in the U.S. and the brutal deficits we have every year?
Well, let's separate privatization from the issue of reliance on the private sector, just so that everyone's clear on terminology. Privatization would be what we did with Conrail, for example. The federal government used to own a freight rail system, company in effect, and that was privatized, completely turned over to the private sector. But when you look at A76 that I mentioned before and the performance of commercial activities, on average, when one of these A76 comparisons is done, there's a 30% savings. Why is that? When I didn't get into this detail previously, but before that agency takes that activity and puts it out for a comparison with the private sector, the agency is permitted to go through a re-engineering process to come up with what's called in the circular a most efficient organization, or MEO. So let's say you have Department of Homeland Security has a widget making function, and they have 50 employees involved in making widgets. They go through an MEO process and say, you know what? we can actually make widgets with 40 people. We don't need all 50. We can introduce automation, improve productivity, and we can do it with 40 people, and therefore it's a 10% lower cost to the way they're making widgets today. That MEO is what gets competed against the private sector. So even if the function ends up staying in-house, the taxpayer wins because you've just realized the saving by going through that most efficient organization process. So if you take the average savings for all of the functions that employ the 1.1 million federal employees that I mentioned earlier that do things that are commercial in nature, the end result is over $27 billion a year in savings. Again, regardless of whether the activity ends up going out to the private sector or stays in-house and starts being performed by that more efficient organization, or MEO. So we're talking about significant savings just on the performance of routine services. That's not looking at big ticket items like, can you privatize the Postal Service? Can you privatize air traffic control? Can you privatize Amtrak? Those would be activities where we completely turn the entire function over. The government no longer owns it. The government no longer manages. The government is no longer the contract manager. A privatization is where you completely turn it over to the private sector and the government washes its hands on it. President Reagan, at the end of his administration, unfortunately this was at the end of his administration, but he put together a privatization commission. They issued an extraordinary report with recommendations on hundreds of things that could be privatized or contracted out. That was done in 1988, 1989 as he was leaving office. Virtually everything in that report is still in the government today. So that's great. That's a great hunting map, if you will, on what is out there that could be turned over to the private sector, but still is resident within the federal government.
Nice. To finish with something a little lighter, in your background or you sent over on privatization, you conclude with a great quote, a great joke of Ronald Reagan about the Soviet Union. I think it really perfectly sums up the difference between relying on government for our goods and services versus the private sector. I just thought you might want to share it with our audience. You may not.
Well, it's thank you. It's very timely if you've seen the movie that's out on Reagan's life. I don't want to spoil it for everyone, but the backdrop of the movie is about the fact that Reagan was a lifelong anti-communist, and he used to love to tell jokes about life in the old Soviet Union. And this Reagan joke just really synthesizes this whole government competition issue. And the story goes that a fellow in the Soviet Union scrimps and saves for years and years and years, and finally has enough money to buy a new car. And he goes to the government-owned, government-run car dealer and negotiates his deal, does all the paperwork, and he's all set to buy his car. And the clerk says, okay, you're all set. Everything is worked out. We'll deliver the car to you in 10 years. And the fellow says, 10 years? That's crazy. Is it going to be ready in the morning or the afternoon? And the clerk says, well, what difference does it make? It's 10 years from now. And the fellow says, well, the plumber's coming in the morning. So that's the kind of efficiency you get when the government tries to do too many things that are better left to private enterprise.
That's pretty good.
Gold.
Well, we're excited about an upcoming MOU that we're signing, Member of Understanding, a partnership. Why is BCFC and JCN signing this partnership?
Well, I think your name says it all. Job creators. That's what this is all about, is creating private sector jobs, creating, incentivizing entrepreneurship. When the private sector takes over something from the government, it's not just a cost saving. It is right-sizing our workforce. It is bringing the economy and efficiency of entrepreneurship to an activity. It's bringing innovation and new technology, things that government can't even purchase quickly and efficiently. And so the track record on this is it really spurs entrepreneurship. It creates private sector jobs. It creates wealth. It creates opportunity. And so our missions between our two respective organizations are so well aligned that, again, this is fundamental to private enterprise. It's fundamental to small business. It's fundamental to job creation. So we look forward to working with JCN. We think we have just so much in common, and that we can really move the ball down this field by working more closely together. So we're really looking forward to that relationship.
Well, we're very excited. Can you also tell our audience where they can go to learn more about BCFC and how they can support your efforts?
Well, it's very simple. Governmentcompetition.com. There's a plethora of information on there about this issue and ways that folks can become involved in our organization and get more information, be more up to speed on things that are happening in this entire activity, and be part of the effort to implement that Yellow Pages test and get our government more focused on things that it really should do, and let private enterprise do what it does best.
Fantastic. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters today, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all to our audience for tuning in. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back soon with another episode.